Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Charleston, South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. In the autumn of 1844, merchants passing through the Charleston slave market on Chalmers Street began to report a peculiar sight that would become the subject of whispered conversations throughout the city. A large hound, its coat matted and ribs visible beneath thinning fur, had taken position beside the weathered oak auction block, refusing all attempts at removal. The animal would accept neither food nor water from strangers, maintaining its vigil through 3 scorching summers and bitter winters. What transpired when that wait finally ended would be documented in letters not discovered until 1889, revealing a truth far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The Charleston slave market in those autumn months operated with the efficiency of any commercial enterprise, the oak auction block worn smooth by countless transactions, conducted beneath the shade of magnolia trees, whose white blossoms had long since fallen to the cobblestones below. September 24th, 1844, had been a particularly active sale day, with 17 human beings transferred from one owner to another before the afternoon shadows lengthened across Chalmers Street. It was in the hours following this crowded auction that the animal first appeared, positioning itself with such deliberate precision beside the block that merchants preparing to close their ledgers could not help but take notice. The hound was of considerable size, its breeding suggesting some combination of hunting stock, with a deep chest and powerful shoulders that spoke of strength now diminished by evident neglect. Slave traders attempting to drive the creature away found their efforts met with passive resistance, the dog simply returning to its chosen spot once they turned their attention elsewhere. By nightfall, speculation had begun among those who frequented the market regarding the animal's origins, with some suggesting it had belonged to one of the day's sellers, while others proposed it had simply wandered in from the countryside, drawn by the scent of the food vendors who served the auction crowds. The persistence of the animal's vigil began to infiltrate the written records of Charleston's merchant class within days of its first appearance, transforming what might have been dismissed as a temporary curiosity into a documented phenomenon that would occupy the margins of business correspondence and personal diaries throughout the following weeks. A leather-bound journal belonging to Samuel Whitmore, a textile merchant whose warehouse stood adjacent to the market, contains entries dated from early October 1844 that describe the hound's unwavering routine with the precision of scientific observation. Whitmore noted that the animal arrived at the auction block each morning precisely at dawn, positioning itself in the exact location it had occupied the previous day, its body oriented not toward the block itself, but toward the eastern approach of Chalmers Street, where the road curved past the brick warehouses and disappeared into the residential districts beyond. The merchant's observations recorded that the dog's gaze remained fixed upon this road throughout the daylight hours, its head lifting at the sound of each approaching wagon or the footsteps of each pedestrian, only to lower again when the anticipated presence failed to materialize. Margaret Thornton, whose boarding house overlooked the market square, wrote to her sister in Columbia, describing her attempts to provide sustenance to the creature, carrying down scraps of salt pork and cornbread that she placed within reach of the animal. Her letter, dated October 12, 1844, expressed both frustration and a peculiar admiration for the dog's refusal to accept her offerings, noting that the food remained untouched until other stray animals eventually claimed it. Similar accounts appeared in the correspondence of at least 6 other Charleston residents during this period, each documenting failed attempts to feed or coax the animal from its post, their collective testimony establishing a pattern of behavior that defied the natural instincts that should have driven any living creature toward sustenance and shelter as the autumn temperatures began their gradual decline. The first identification of the animal by name would not surface in the historical record until 1912, when a graduate student at the College of Charleston, conducting research into the economic operations of the antebellum slave trade, discovered a mundane accounting ledger belonging to a market clerk named William Prescott, whose daily notations regarding transactions and market conditions occasionally included observations of a more personal nature. An entry dated November 3rd, 1844, buried among columns of figures documenting the sale prices of rice and cotton, contained a brief notation that the old Negro workers who swept the market grounds and maintained the auction platform had been observed speaking in low tones near the persistent hound, and that Prescott had overheard them refer to the animal by a name, Keeper. The clerk's curiosity, apparently piqued by this revelation, led him to make discreet inquiries among these same workers, and his ledger entry from November 7th recorded what he had learned through these conversations, though he noted the information was offered with considerable reluctance, and only after he assured them his interest was merely personal rather than official. The dog, according to these whispered accounts, had belonged to a blacksmith named Josiah, who had been property of the Rutledge plantation, some 12 miles distant from Charleston, and who had been brought to the Chalmers Street auction block on September 24th to be sold as part of the settlement of the estate following the death of the plantation's patriarch. The older workers reportedly stated that Josiah had been accompanied by the hound on the morning of his sale, that the animal had remained at his side throughout the hours of waiting before the auction commenced, and that when Josiah was finally led away by his new owner, the dog had attempted to follow until restrained by the auction staff, after which it had taken up its vigil at the block where it had last seen its master standing. The complete details of Josiah's sale would remain obscured in the bureaucratic archives of Charleston County until 1889, when a historian researching the dissolution of low country plantation estates following the deaths of their proprietors requested access to probate records from the 1840s, and among the volumes of inventories and debt settlements discovered the specific documentation pertaining to the Rutledge property. The estate papers revealed that Josiah, listed in the inventory as a male Negro, aged 28 years, skilled in the trade of blacksmithing with particular expertise in the manufacture of agricultural implements and the shoeing of horses, had been valued at $1,200, a considerable sum that reflected both his youth and his specialized capabilities. The purchaser of record was identified as Thaddeus Brennan, a cotton merchant from Natchez, Mississippi, who had traveled to Charleston specifically to acquire skilled laborers for his expanding operations in the Mississippi Delta, where the cultivation of cotton on newly cleared lands required not only field workers, but also artisans capable of maintaining the mechanical equipment and tools essential to large-scale agricultural production. The sale had been necessitated by the death of William Rutledge, who had expired in August of 1844, leaving debts totaling nearly $18,000, primarily owed to factors in Charleston and Savannah, who had extended credit against anticipated rice harvests that had failed to materialize due to 2 consecutive seasons of flooding along the Ashley River. The probate documents further revealed that the estate had contained 23 enslaved individuals at the time of Rutledge's death, of whom only Josiah and 3 field laborers had been sold to satisfy creditors, while the remainder, including a woman named Clara, identified as Josiah's wife, and 2 children listed as Benjamin and Sarah, aged 6 and 4 respectively, had been retained by the estate and transferred to the management of Rutledge's widow, who continued to operate the plantation under the supervision of a hired overseer. The fragmentary record of Josiah's existence in Mississippi would emerge decades after the events themselves surfacing in 1923 when the great-granddaughter of a New Orleans cotton factor, clearing out the attic of the family's Garden District home in preparation for its sale, discovered several crates of business correspondence dating from the antebellum period, including a substantial collection of letters exchanged between her ancestor, Henri Moreau, and various clients throughout the cotton-growing regions of the South. Among these yellowed and brittle documents were 7 letters from Thaddeus Brennan, written between October 1844 and March 1845, discussing matters of crop yields, commodity prices, and the management of his Mississippi operations. 3 of these letters contained brief references to Josiah, the first dated November 12, 1844, in which Brennan noted to his factor that the Charleston blacksmith had proven his worth immediately upon arrival, having already repaired several pieces of essential equipment that had been sitting idle for lack of skilled attention. The letter described Josiah's work as superior in quality, but observed that the man himself was notably withdrawn, performing his duties with silent efficiency, but engaging in no conversation beyond what was absolutely necessary, a disposition that Brennan characterized as melancholic and attributed to the common adjustment difficulties experienced by newly purchased slaves separated from familiar surroundings. A subsequent letter, dated January 8, 1845, mentioned that Josiah had approached the plantation overseer with a request for permission to send a message to Charleston, and that this request had been denied on the grounds that allowing such communications would establish an undesirable precedent and might encourage discontent among the other laborers. Brennan's letter to Moreau noted this incident not as a matter of concern, but rather as an illustration of proper management practices, explaining that he had personally spoken with Josiah to explain that his former life was now concluded and that his focus must be entirely upon his present circumstances and responsibilities. The winter of 1844 through 1845 brought temperatures to Charleston that had not been recorded in nearly a decade, with frost appearing on the cobblestones of the market square as early as mid-December and persisting through the morning hours well into February, and it was during these months that the physical deterioration of the animal became a subject of documentation in sources ranging from the practical observations of merchants to the more contemplative reflections of the city's clergy. Reverend Thomas Ashford, pastor of St. Michael's Episcopal Church, whose daily constitutional took him past the slave market each morning, maintained a diary that would later be donated to the South Carolina Historical Society, and his entry from January 14, 1845, described discovering the hound covered in a layer of snow following a particularly severe overnight storm, the animal's form barely visible against the white blanketed auction block, yet still positioned in its customary orientation toward the eastern road. The pastor noted that he had attempted to brush the snow from the creature's coat, but the dog had shown neither gratitude nor interest in his ministrations, remaining motionless except for the slight rise and fall of its breathing. By this point in the winter, the animal's ribs had become starkly visible beneath its matted fur, and the once powerful shoulders had diminished to angles of bone barely covered by skin. Children from the nearby residential streets, having adopted the name keeper that they had overheard from market workers, constructed a crude shelter from wooden crates and canvas, positioning it near the auction block in the hope that the dog might seek protection from the elements. But their efforts went entirely unused, the animal continuing to maintain its exposed position regardless of wind, rain, or freezing temperatures. The community's response to this ongoing spectacle divided along curious lines, with some residents expressing straightforward pity and continuing their futile attempts at intervention, while others began to regard the animal with a superstitious unease, suggesting in whispered conversations that such unnatural devotion could only be explained by forces beyond ordinary animal instinct. The correspondence of the Rutledge family, preserved in the manuscript collections of the South Carolina Historical Society, contains a letter that would prove crucial to understanding the human dimension of the vigil unfolding at the Charleston slave market, written by Margaret Rutledge, widow of the deceased plantation owner, to her sister Elizabeth Morrison in Savannah, and dated March 19, 1845. The letter, composed in the elegant script characteristic of educated women of the planter class, devoted several paragraphs to family business and social matters before turning to a subject that clearly troubled its author, describing a recent journey into Charleston, during which she had occasion to pass through the market district and observe the animal that had become such a persistent fixture at the auction block. Margaret Rutledge wrote that the sight had disturbed her considerably, not merely because of the creature's obviously deteriorating condition, but because she recognized the hound as having belonged to Josiah, and the recognition had brought to her mind the circumstances of his sale and the necessity that had required it. The letter then revealed information that would not otherwise have entered the historical record, stating that Clara, Josiah's wife, had undertaken the 12-mile walk from the plantation to the Charleston market on at least 3 occasions during the winter months, making this journey for the sole purpose of visiting the dog, and that overseers had reported finding her sitting beside the animal for hours at a time. Margaret Rutledge's letter described Clara's reaction to the sight of Keeper as one of profound grief, noting that the woman had wept openly at the auction block, apparently heedless of the attention such display might attract from passing merchants and market workers. Most significantly, the letter conveyed what Clara had reportedly stated to the plantation's housekeeper upon returning from one of these visits, expressing her conviction that Josiah had trained the dog to wait at that precise location, and that this training could only mean that he intended to return to Charleston, that he would find a way to come back for his family. The transformation of the dog's vigil from a local oddity, witnessed primarily by those whose business brought them regularly to the market district, into a subject of broader public awareness, occurred during the summer months of 1845, when the Charleston Mercury, the city's most widely circulated newspaper, published a brief item in its July 12th edition under the heading of Local Curiosities, describing the hound that had maintained its position at the Chalmers Street auction block for nearly 10 months without apparent sustenance or shelter. The article, written in the somewhat sensational style that characterized such human interest pieces, invited readers to witness this remarkable example of animal fidelity, and the publication of this notice resulted in increased foot traffic to the market square, as Charleston residents, who had previously been unaware of the situation, came to observe the phenomenon for themselves. It was during this same period that rumors concerning Josiah's circumstances in Mississippi began to circulate through the informal networks of communication that connected enslaved populations across the South, carried by the domestic servants who accompanied their owners on visits between plantations, by the stevedores and boatmen who worked the river traffic, and by the free people of color whose travels for purposes of trade or employment allowed them to gather and transmit information that would never appear in official records. A notation in a harbor master's log from August 1845, discovered during a separate research project in 1967, recorded the statement of a steamboat worker named Jacob Pierce, who claimed to have seen a blacksmith matching Josiah's description working in chains at a plantation landing near Natchez, suggesting that some incident had resulted in his being subjected to heightened security measures. Another account, this one preserved in the diary of a Charleston physician who treated enslaved patients, mentioned hearing from one of his informants that word had reached the city regarding an attempted escape by a Mississippi blacksmith, subsequently recaptured, though the diary entry noted that such stories were notoriously unreliable and subject to embellishment. The passage of the animal into its second winter of vigil marked a deterioration so profound that even those citizens who had previously dismissed the situation as merely peculiar began to express genuine alarm regarding the creature's condition, leading to an intervention that would be documented in medical records discovered in 1894 among the archived papers of Dr. Edmund Carlisle, a Charleston physician whose practice included both human patients and occasional consultations regarding livestock and domestic animals. Dr. Carlisle's case notes, dated December 8, 1845, indicated that he had been summoned to the slave market by a group of concerned merchants and residents who feared that the hound might be suffering from some contagious disease that could pose a threat to other animals in the vicinity. Their concern apparently motivated less by compassion for the dog itself than by worry that a diseased creature maintaining such a public position might reflect poorly upon the commercial reputation of the market district. The physician's examination, conducted in the late afternoon, as winter shadows lengthened across the cobblestones, revealed that the animal weighed perhaps 40 pounds, a reduction he estimated to be less than half its original mass, based on the bone structure visible beneath the taut, nearly translucent skin. Dr. Carlisle noted in his report that every rib could be counted with absolute precision, that the hip bones protruded at sharp angles, and that the muscle tissue that should have covered the shoulders and haunches had wasted to almost nothing, leaving the dog's frame resembling what he described as an anatomical study rather than a living creature. His professional assessment concluded that the animal showed no signs of rabies, distemper, or any other communicable disease, but rather presented a textbook case of advanced starvation, and that its continued survival after more than 14 months in this condition defied his medical understanding of the ordinary limits of mammalian endurance, leading him to note in his records that he could offer no scientific explanation for how the creature remained alive. The revelation of Clara's regular visits to the dog would emerge not from any document directly concerned with the animal's vigil, but rather from testimony recorded during a Charleston County court case in April 1846, a property dispute involving the boundaries of several commercial lots near the market district, during which a witness named Thomas Hawthorne, a provision merchant whose shop faced the auction block, was asked to establish his credibility by demonstrating his familiarity with the daily activities and traffic patterns of the area. In the course of his testimony, preserved in the court records that would later be microfilmed by the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, Hawthorne stated that he could account for the regular comings and goings of the district because his position behind the shop counter afforded him an unobstructed view of the street, and he offered as example his recognition of certain individuals who appeared with predictable frequency, including a Negro woman from the Rutledge plantation who arrived at the market each Saturday without fail to visit the dog that had taken up residence at the auction block. The merchant's testimony described how this woman, whom he later identified as Clara, when questioned about the specifics of his observation, would bring with her small parcels wrapped in cloth containing what appeared to be food scraps, and that the dog, which refused all sustenance from other sources, would accept these offerings from her hands and consume them in her presence. Hawthorne further testified that Clara would typically remain at the auction block for 2 or 3 hours during each visit, sitting on the ground beside the animal, regardless of the weather or the condition of the cobblestones, and that he had observed her speaking to the dog throughout these vigils, though he could not discern her words from his distance. However, the merchant noted that on one occasion, when his business had taken him outside his shop, at a moment when Clara sat near the block, he had heard her speaking to the animal in tones that suggested she was delivering a message, and he recalled distinctly hearing her state that he was coming back, that he had promised he was coming back. The existence of a letter that never reached its intended recipient would only come to light through the posthumous confession of a minor functionary in Charleston's postal system, a document discovered in 1889 when the estate of a former postal clerk named Jeremiah Watts was being settled following his death at the age of 73. Among the papers found in a locked drawer of his desk was a handwritten statement, dated only days before his death, in which Watts described an incident from his employment at the Charleston Post Office more than 4 decades earlier that had, according to his own account, weighed upon his conscience throughout the intervening years. The confession detailed how, in April of 1846, a letter addressed to Clara, in care of the Rutledge Plantation, bearing a postmark from Natchez, Mississippi, had arrived at the Charleston facility and been processed for delivery to the rural route that serviced the plantation districts along the Ashley River. However, before the letter could be included in the mail carrier's bag, Watts had been approached by a man identifying himself as Samuel Garrett, the overseer recently employed to manage the Rutledge property, who explained that he had been instructed by the plantation's owner to intercept any correspondence arriving for the enslaved workers, as such communications were deemed disruptive to plantation discipline and order. Garrett had offered Watts a sum of $5, more than a week's wages for a postal clerk, to ensure that this particular letter never reached the Rutledge plantation, and Watts admitted in his confession that he had accepted this payment and destroyed the letter without recording its contents or preserving any documentation of its existence. The confession noted that Watts had not opened or read the letter before destroying it, stating that he had considered doing so, but ultimately decided that such knowledge would only compound his guilt, and thus the substance of what Josiah may have written to his wife in that April of 1846 passed into permanent obscurity. The convergence of events that would bring this story to its devastating conclusion began with a mundane entry in the harbor master's log at Charleston's busy waterfront, a routine notation dated August 14, 1847, recording the arrival of the freight vessel Meridian out of New Orleans, carrying a cargo of textiles, machinery parts, and 7 passengers, among whom the log specifically identified a free man of color named Josiah Freeman, age 31, traveling with manumission papers issued by the state of Mississippi and certified by a notary in Natchez. The harbor master's careful documentation of this particular passenger reflected not any special interest in the individual himself, but rather the legal requirements that governed the movement of free black individuals throughout the southern states, mandating that such travelers present themselves to local authorities upon arrival in any South Carolina port and register their presence, their purpose for visiting, and the expected duration of their stay. The papers that Josiah Freeman presented to the harbor master's office, later filed in the archives where they would be discovered during a comprehensive digitization project in 2003, indicated that he had been granted his freedom on July 30, 1847, through self-purchase, having accumulated the sum of $1,500 over a period of nearly 3 years through wages earned for extra work performed beyond his required labor obligations. The log entry noted that Freeman stated his purpose in Charleston as personal business related to family members, and that he intended to remain in the city for an unspecified period. What the harbor master couldn't have known, and what his meticulous record-keeping therefore failed to capture, was that at the very moment these papers were being examined and filed in the Customs House on East Bay Street, less than half a mile away on Chalmers Street, a skeletal hound lay in its customary position beside the auction block where it had maintained an unbroken vigil for 1,056 days, waiting for the return of a man who now walked the streets of Charleston, carrying freedom papers bearing a surname he had chosen for himself. The events of August 16, 1847, would be documented with unusual thoroughness due to the number of witnesses present in the market district during the late morning hours, their accounts later collected by city officials investigating a disturbance that had drawn a crowd and temporarily disrupted commercial activities in the area. The most detailed statement came from Robert Ashford, proprietor of a dry goods establishment on Chalmers Street, who testified that he had been arranging inventory near his shop window when he observed a black man approaching the auction block from the direction of East Bay Street, walking with a pronounced limp that suggested some old injury to his left leg and carrying a worn leather satchel that appeared to contain all his worldly possessions. Ashford noted that the man's gait was slow and deliberate, and that he seemed to be scanning the market square as he walked, as though searching for something or someone among the morning traffic of merchants and labourers. The dog, which, according to multiple witnesses, had been lying motionless in its customary position, its breathing so shallow that some passers-by had assumed it already dead, suddenly lifted its head as the man drew within perhaps 30 yards of the auction block. What happened next was described with remarkable consistency across at least 7 separate witness statements. The animal attempted to rise to its feet, its emaciated legs trembling with effort as it struggled to support even its diminished weight, managed to stand for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds before its strength failed entirely and collapsed back onto the cobblestones. The man, who had quickened his pace upon seeing the dog's movement, broke into an awkward run despite his limp, dropping his satchel as he crossed the remaining distance to the auction block. Witnesses reported that upon reaching the animal and recognizing it, the man fell to his knees beside the dog and gathered the creature into his arms, and that the sound he made at that moment was unlike anything they had heard before, described variously as a wail, a moan, and a cry that seemed to contain 3 years of accumulated grief released in a single instant. Dr. Edmund Carlyle, the same physician who had examined the dog during the previous winter, was summoned to the slave market on the afternoon of August 16th by city constables who had been called to manage the crowd that had gathered around the auction block, and his professional report, filed with the Charleston municipal authorities and preserved in the city's medical records, provides the clinical documentation of what transpired during those final moments of the vigil that had consumed nearly 3 years. The physician's account stated that upon his arrival at approximately 11:30 in the morning, he found a free man of color, later identified as Josiah Freeman, kneeling on the cobblestones, while cradling in his arms the body of the hound that had been the subject of so much local attention, and that his initial examination confirmed the animal had expired, likely within minutes of the man's arrival, its heart having finally ceased after enduring deprivations that should have proven fatal many months earlier. Dr. Carlyle's report then turned to observations regarding Josiah himself, noting that in the course of attempting to provide what limited comfort medical science could offer to a man in such profound distress, he had observed extensive scarring across the man's back and shoulders, the marks consistent with repeated applications of the lash, as well as similar scarring on both legs, and evidence of a fracture to the left, tibia that had healed poorly, leaving the leg slightly shortened and explaining the pronounced limp with which witnesses reported he had been walking. The physician documented that Josiah appeared to be suffering from malnutrition himself, though not to the extreme degree exhibited by the animal, and that his hands bore the calluses and burn scars typical of a blacksmith's trade. Most significantly, Dr. Carlyle noted that Josiah remained utterly inconsolable, unresponsive to attempts at communication, and had to be physically removed from the location by constables after nearly 2 hours, during which time he had refused to release the dog's body from his grasp. The final piece of this historical puzzle would emerge 42 years after the events at the auction block, when in 1889 the Charleston Historical Society received an anonymous donation of personal papers contained in a wooden box accompanied by a note stating only that these documents pertained to a man named Josiah Freeman and might be of interest to scholars studying the antebellum period. Among the contents were 11 letters, written in a careful hand that suggested their author had received instruction in literacy, each dated between October 1844 and August 1847, but bearing no evidence of ever having been posted or delivered. These letters, apparently composed as a form of personal record, documented in devastating detail the 3 years Josiah had spent in Mississippi working toward the accumulation of funds sufficient to purchase his freedom. The writings described conditions of labor that extended far beyond standard obligations, detailing how he had negotiated with Brennan to perform additional blacksmithing work for neighboring plantations in exchange for a portion of the fees, working by lantern light long after other laborers had retired, and carefully hoarding every cent in a hiding place he never specified. One letter, dated March 1845, recounted an attempted escape that had resulted in his recapture within 2 days, followed by punishment so severe that he had nearly died from the resulting infections and the permanent damage to his leg that would mark him for the remainder of his life. The most heartrending document bore the date August 10th, 1847, and described his joy at having finally accumulated the $1,500 required for his manumission, his immediate plans to travel to Charleston, and his absolute certainty that Keeper would still be waiting at the auction block where they had been separated. The subsequent fate of Josiah Freeman remains largely obscure in the historical record, with only a single entry in the 1851 Charleston City Directory listing a blacksmith by that name operating a small forge on Meeting Street, though whether this represented a life rebuilt or merely existence cannot be determined from such sparse evidence, and the question of whether Clara ever learned of his return, whether they were reunited, or whether circumstances prevented even this final connection, remains unanswered in any document yet discovered.